delighted to have so many of you here today on this lovely fall morning. We've got a great panel today, all friends, a couple of WITA board members as well. Really pleased to have such an expert group here to talk about trade development. It's been a little while. WITA's been very focused on a lot of the things happening on trade on a day-to-day basis, as we all are monitoring our media feeds, social media feeds, to find out what's happening next on trade these days. It's easy to kind of lose track that there's a lot of things happening around the world on trade that we're sometimes not as focused on here in Washington, so we're really glad to have a chance to do that today with such a fantastic panel. Speaking of some of the current events, we have some really great events coming up here at WITA next week. We'll be looking at CFIUS export controls, and there's something called a supply chain executive order on information technologies that the Trump administration has put forward. We're going to be having a discussion about that next Wednesday. We have the WITA does every year a FDA boot camp learning about food and drug regulation with a group called Registrar Corp. That's next week as well, next Friday. And then we're going to be, actually it'll be live later today, but we're going to be doing an event looking at proposals to create new tax regimes for the digital economy. And we'll be doing that event on November 6th. There's the placeholders on the back of your flyer with information on that. We'll announce the panel for that later today. And lastly, I want to just flag for people, we beginning part of this year, we held our first International Trade Conference. That was in January of 2019. We're going to have our second one on February 4th, again here at the Reagan Building. It's an all-day trade conference. We're already in the process of lining up some fantastic speakers, and we hope many of you will join us. And if you're interested in learning about sponsorships, please contact Diego Inez at WITA. We'll give you information about that, or obviously I'm happy to take your calls on that. With that, we're going to turn it over to our panel. One special ground rule for today. Are very pleased to have Ed Gresser from USTR join us today, but he's asked that his remarks be off the record. You can use the information you learned today, certainly, from Ed, in any of your work that you're doing, but you can't attribute it. We are going to be making a video of the event overall, but we will not have Ed's portion on that. So if you could please respect that and keep Ed's remarks off the record, that would be great. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Katrin Kuhlman, a WITA board member, and who's spread incredibly thin with many different obligations, traveling around the world, but we're delighted to have been able to make the event work to have you with us today. Katrin, thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And it's so fantastic to see a packed room to talk about trade and development. This is a topic that many of us have been working on for quite a long time, and I think that right now, with everything that's going on trade, I think development is really at the center of many of these debates. So we thought that it would be a good opportunity to pull together this panel to talk about several different aspects of trade and development. And I think I will introduce the panelists. I'm just going to speak very briefly and then go to the panel, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So I hope that you'll all think about questions that you want to ask too. One of the things that we really want to focus on today are the trade preference programs, which have really been a mainstay of trade and development for decades, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well. And there, I think, are some interesting dynamics happening right now with the trade preference programs that Ed and Dan in particular will talk about because of some of the other things that are going on with international trade, creating challenges and opportunities. But I think it's even more important than ever to talk about trade preference programs and the role that they play in trade with emerging markets around the world. There also were some very interesting developments, I guess, and models emerging on trade and development in places like sub-Saharan Africa, which I think Steve Lanty will touch on, and I probably will make some comments on that as well. That's an area that I focus on too through my work and research. And I think that right now we're seeing, as trade becomes really such a big issue around the world, that there are different approaches that are coming out of different parts of the world that really, I should tell you too that I focus a lot on trade and development. I run a nonprofit organization called the New Markets Lab, which some of you may know, and I teach law school at Georgetown Law School. I teach trade and development as well. And I think that these agreements that are coming up really have the potential to change international law in a very profound way. So We'll talk about those, the politics behind them, some of the components of those agreements. And then I think that a discussion on trade and development really wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk also about development assistance and capacity building. And so our conversation is going to kind of round out with that. I think we'll touch on many parts of the world. We're not really limiting ourselves geographically, I don't think. So please don't feel like you need to limit yourselves in your contributions to the discussion. But let me introduce the panel, and then I'll turn to Ed first for his remarks. So we're, as Ken said, really delighted to have Ed Gresser with us today, who's been working on these issues for a very long time and producing just amazing work on making the connections between the political economy aspects and the economic aspects of trade and development. Ed is now the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Trade Policy and Economics at USTR. And as Ken said, Ed is going to speak off the record, so when we turn to him in a second, that will be going off the record, as mentioned. But he's going to give us, some insight into GSP and how the preference programs have worked in the context of U.S. trade flows, which I think we can all learn a lot from Ed, for certain. And then we'll turn to Dan Anthony, who's the Vice President of the Trade Partnership, who has spent many years working on trade preference programs, and Dan will give us some insight into what's happening right now and why this debate about preferences is even more live now than ever before. Then I'll turn to Steve Lanty, to Dan's right, who's the President of Manchester Trade, and Steve's going to talk a bit more about Africa, and I think maybe India as well, and some of these issues that are coming up on developing countries, including, I think, and if he's not going to now, he has to, talking about how developing countries are being approached in the context of the World Trade Organization and this whole issue of what is a developing country, what does development really mean in the context of trade, and how is that debate playing out. And then last but certainly not least, as I said, to really round out the discussion, I'll turn to Orit Frankel, who's the Executive Director of the American Leadership Initiative. And Orit is going to talk more about development assistance and kind of a holistic view of trade and development. So we're really, really pleased to have this panel. I hope you enjoy it.